Renaissance swept across Europe in the 14th century and lasted till the 17th century. Renaissance, in essence, means a rebirth or looking at knowledge at fresh light, through a new eyes. Literature and criticism was much impacted due to this aspect of Renaissance, because it touched almost all the parts in literature and especially criticism. People were confused as to whether to linger to the old classicist methods that were followed from Rome or from Greece, the Greek classicists, I mean. And there was much interest in the vernacular that was happening in the form of Italian literature and English literature. So as to say that English literature was a nest of singing birds and a flurry of literary activities was happening in Great Britain. Much to this confusion came the Puritan thought that all literature should be moral. In fact, the Puritans mentioned and they emphasized that morality in literature as such, should be filled with morality. So what do the people who were engaged in literature? They were between classicism, they had a love for vernacular, and they had a Puritan mindset which overpowered them. Into these three dimensions of thought process and into these three areas and perspectives came the famous Sir Philip Sidney. Sir Philip Sidney's apology for poetry, or the defense of poetry, is considered as one of the best critique that extolled the virtues of poetry. Remember, he wrote Apology of Poetry as a compliment to the insult made to him by Stephen Gosson's School of Abuse. Stephen Gosson attacked the people who were engaged in literature at that time, stating that they were of less morality. Of course, Stephen Gosson was a Puritan. Sir Philip Sidney also was in two minds, not in two minds, but in three minds, as to whether what to do at this particular stage, because he followed his teachers such as the Greek masters. He had a love for the vernacular, and also he was surrounded by the Puritan thought that was happening and engaging in Britain at that time. But nevertheless, Sir Philip Sidney had an ideal and character of his own. If we could remember the great moral that Philip Sidney has given to the outer world in a war, in a battlefield in which he gave water that he received, and when he got that water as a succor and relief, what he gave was that he gave it to a soldier who was more bruised and battered than Sir Philip Sidney, stating that thy need is greater than mine. So the ages and the thought that happened in Europe or Britain could not influence Sir Philip Sidney as such. Philip Sidney was a master in his trade. He took the attack and insult of Stephen Gosson, stating that his art and line of poetry is much greater and much important than the things that he could see around. One of the things that he mentioned was that poetry should do more than instruct and delight. He went on to extol the values of poetry. He said that the school of poetry as such, had been receiving much criticism in the form of insult and harpoon over the last several decades. In fact, if we could closely perceive the literature and the criticism of Sir Philip Sidney, we could understand that his writing was not against Philip Gosson. His writing was against the thought that was provided from his Greek masters onwards. If we could look at the ancient literary criticism scenario as such, Plato was against poetry. Aristotle said that poetry is great, poetry is the highest form, but it is not fit to be written in poem as such. Then after that, the one person who stood for poetry was Horace. Then Longinus stated that art should be in the sublime form. And Philip Sidney, after taking all these things into consideration, asserted and reconfirmed the fact that poetry is the best. What he said by being the best is nothing, but it is highly rewarded. Poetry makes us change the ordinary world to a better world. It changes the barren world to a world full of stars and shine. He said that it is virtue rewarded. And he also goes on to state the fact that poetry has been bruised and battered by many people centuries before. And his treatise, An Apology of Poetry, or the defense of poetry, is something in which he forgives the poets and the poetry that has taken place before that. And he also concludes by saying that poetry is the best of the art form. Why he states it is the best of the art form? It is nothing but of the sheer fact that the poem that we see around, or the poetry that we could see around, makes us change as humans into a better world. If only we get a better world, will we get better things in life. So to sum it up, Sir Philip Sidney lived in the midst of great controversies. He lived in the midst of great opposites, and due to his great personality and his charming thoughts and his unequivocal mannerism and the policies that he took for himself, presented a whole new world with the important fact that poetry is the best that we could absorb, or the art of poetry has been pushed to a corner by the people before that. And he apologized for the poets and the poetry that has contributed much to the betterment of the world. And he stated that poetry is the best. So his apology for poetry states, and it lasts as one of the best treatises that we could see in the world, or in any world that is going to happen, to see a dominant place of importance given to literature. Thank you very much. Do take care.